There is a kind of power that makes others fall silent in your presence, not because you are overly strong, but because there is something within you they cannot comprehend. A strange calmness, an unshakable gaze, an aura that makes others feel they cannot be lazy in front of you. People call it discipline, but in truth, it is discipline that has passed through hell, where a person no longer fights the world, but their own unconscious. Jung once said that most of what we call willpower is merely the product of the unconscious. We think we choose, but in fact, we are being led by habits, emotions, memories, and fears. Therefore, those who lack discipline are not weak. They are simply being controlled by an untrained unconscious. And those who possess true discipline do not force or prove anything, because they have taught their unconscious to stand on their side. In today's journey, we will walk through the deeper layers of discipline Jung once described, from the place where the fragile ego is shattered, to the moment your soul is reborn in silence. For only when you learn to command the unconscious will you truly be free. And when you complete this path, you will realize discipline has never been a war against the world. It is a sacred ritual to return to yourself. Number 1. Facing the shadow when you realize you've betrayed yourself. There is something fascinating about human nature. We begin every journey with enthusiasm. Each new year, after reading an inspiring book or seeing someone successful, a fire ignites inside us. We make plans, promises, vows that this time will be different. But only a few weeks later, the motivation fades and we return to where we started. Why? How can we love our ideals so much, yet fail to live by them? Carl Jung called this the conflict between the conscious and the unconscious, the shadow conflict. The conscious part says, I want to be more disciplined. But the unconscious, the inner shadow, whispers, don't rest. We deserve comfort. And that part, unseen, unnamed, is the one that actually controls your life. Notice this. You're not lacking energy to persist. You stay up late scrolling online. You wake up early for flights. The problem isn't ability. It's the contradiction between two parts of your mind. One part wants to grow. The other wants safety. One part wants to evolve. The other just wants you to rest, delay, and find reasons to pause. Jung once wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, you cannot truly be disciplined without understanding the part of you that resists discipline. Every act of breaking your own promise begins from within. Imagine this. You set a goal to wake up at 5 a.m. to read. The first day, you leap out of bed, full of excitement. The second day, you hesitate for a few minutes. The third day, the voice in your head begins to negotiate. Just for today, sleeping a little longer won't hurt. That logic is the tool of the shadow. It convinces you you're being smart, when in fact, you're retreating. The shadow is not a demon. It is the forgotten part of you, laziness, fear of failure, need for comfort or pride that doesn't want to do what it's not good at. When you avoid looking at these, they rule you from behind. If you apply discipline merely as a technique, you're layering light over darkness that hasn't been acknowledged. Sooner or later, the shadow returns, stronger, more cunning. One way to identify the one within who sabotages you is to listen to your recurring excuses. Every time you're about to do something hard, notice what the mind says. Today's not the right time. I'll do it when I have more motivation. I should prepare better first. They sound logical, but behind them lies fear. And discipline can never defeat fear if you don't name it. You can start by writing down the moments you've betrayed yourself. Not to blame, but to recognize patterns. When you see the other within, the one who's afraid, the one who delays, you begin to step into real freedom. Many think discipline is about forcing oneself, being tougher. But the deepest discipline comes from understanding oneself. Like a patient teacher with a mischievous student, not punishing but observing, understanding, then guiding. Just like in meditation, you cannot force the mind to be silent by strength. You can only observe it until it quiets itself. Discipline is the same. You don't defeat the shadow. You bring light to it. When you look at the part of you you usually avoid, you may feel fear, because it holds everything you don't want to admit: weakness, selfishness, desire, laziness. But that moment is the threshold of true change. No one can build real discipline without passing through the corridor of darkness. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Awakening comes with pain, because you must accept that all this time, the one breaking every promise wasn't circumstance, but you. When you face it, the energy that used to leak through denial begins to return. You no longer have to force yourself, because you're no longer divided. The shadow ceases to be an enemy. It becomes an ally. This is the beginning of true discipline, inner unification. When you no longer have two voices arguing, action becomes natural. When you no longer pretend to be strong, real strength begins to form. So, if you've ever felt undisciplined, don't rush to judge yourself. Ask instead, what part of me is resisting this? What is it afraid of? And listen without judgment. Only when you are brave enough to face the darkness will you truly become disciplined. Because discipline is not control, it is the unification of the soul. Number 2, turning behavior into identity, from I'm trying to I am. Most people think discipline is about doing something long enough to create a habit. But for Carl Jung, true discipline doesn't reside merely in action, it resides in being. Because as long as you are still trying, you are still living in two worlds. One of the person who wants to change, and one of the person who still doesn't believe they can. And only when you move from I'm trying to meditate every day to I am someone who meditates every day does the inner war finally end. That is the moment when effort turns into existence, when you no longer seek discipline, but become the living embodiment of it. Jung called this the transformation of the persona, the social mask we wear every day. The one who is trying is the image we want others to see, responsible, determined, organized. But beneath that mask, the unconscious still doesn't fully believe in that image. It still thinks of us as someone who procrastinates, fails, or quits. And that is why every attempt feels temporary. You cannot live a disciplined life if deep down you still believe, I'm not that kind of person. When the inner self is divided, every external effort becomes fragile, rootless. There are people who exercise every morning not because they are training, but because they are the kind of people who cannot not move. They don't negotiate with sleep. They don't need motivation. Just like someone brushing their teeth, they don't need inspiration to do it. When a behavior becomes identity, it ceases to be a choice. It is a silent rebirth where the habit is no longer a duty, but the natural pulse of life. Jung would call this the formation of essential energy. When you say, "I am a disciplined person," you're sending a command deep into the unconscious, forcing every part of the mind to align with it. At that point, action no longer depends on emotion, but is driven by identity. And identity, once imprinted, holds more power than any plan or technique. Picture a candle. Before it's lit, the light depends on an external flame. But when the wax begins to melt, the flame fuses into the candle itself. It no longer needs an external source. Discipline is the same. When you're still trying, you rely on outside motivation to keep going. But when discipline becomes identity, action is lit from within. A study from Harvard Business Review once showed that when people publicly commit to a specific behavior, their chances of maintaining it increase by up to 65% compared to keeping it private. Because at that moment, the act is no longer a personal choice, it becomes part of social identity. The unconscious understands that abandoning the behavior equals losing one's place in the tribe, triggering a survival response. When you grasp this, you begin to see that discipline isn't about forcing yourself. It's about reprogramming your self-image. You're not fighting old desires. You're changing the person who has them. And this is what Jung called the restructuring of the being, where you no longer play the role of the disciplined person. You are that person. However, this transformation takes time. In the early stages, you still have to play the role a little, like someone learning a new language. At first, every sentence feels awkward, but after enough repetition, you stop speaking English and start thinking in English. Likewise, you stop practicing discipline and start living as a disciplined person. Through repetition, the old ego dissolves, making space for a stronger, more natural self. Remember, the unconscious doesn't understand reasoning, it only understands repetition. Every repeated action is an affirmation sent to the mind. This is who I am. And over time, that action ceases to be effort. It becomes instinct. So instead of asking, "How do I keep this habit?" ask, "Who am I becoming by doing this?" That question is more powerful than any technique. When identity shifts, the entire structure of life rearranges, because the universe always mirrors the frequency of who you are becoming. When you truly become the person you wish to be, you no longer need to push yourself. You're simply living in alignment with your nature. And that is the level of discipline that intimidates others. You don't need motivation to act, because you've become the action itself. If you've ever struggled to sustain a habit, share your story in the comments. Maybe that moment you nearly gave up, or when you realized you no longer needed motivation, just presence. Because your story might inspire someone still in the trying phase to cross into the being one. Number 3, transcending the body, when biology no longer controls will. And when you've turned discipline from a behavior into identity, when I'm trying becomes I am, the journey has only begun. Because beyond the mind, a stronger opponent awaits, your own body. Even when the mind decides, the body resists. Jung called it the rebellion of instinct, when the biological part of us refuses to obey the will. Every morning the body whispers, "Just 5 more minutes." Every time you seek change, it tries to pull you back to the familiar. Not because it's evil, but because the body was designed to conserve energy, while the soul was born to transcend limits. Between these two forces, humanity is stretched thin. You're not just fighting laziness, You're facing a biological system programmed to resist transformation. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And to become that, you must rise above the biological shell, the place where the body always drags you toward comfort and repetition. When the soul is weak, the body mirrors it through fatigue and procrastination. But when the soul awakens, the body becomes a tool instead of a prison." I once heard about a woman named Clara, a 36-year-old graphic designer in New York. For years, she lived in a cycle of exhaustion, unable to wake early, unable to keep any routine. Her body seemed to pull her down every time she tried to rise. Until one day she read Jung's concept of discipline as ritual and decided to try something. Instead of trying, she would ritualize the act. She chose 6 a.m. as her sacred hour for drawing, not for work, not for clients, but as a personal vow. The first day, her body protested. The second day, her mind negotiated. Just today, skipping won't hurt. But she didn't argue. She simply repeated the ritual, made tea, turned on the light, opened the sketchbook, and drew. The first week was torture. The second week, the resistance lessened. By the fourth week, something miraculous happened. She woke before the alarm. The body, after rebelling, surrendered and rewired itself. Clara said, "I realized the body doesn't hate discipline. It just waits for a soul strong enough to lead." And that is what Jung meant. Every repeated action done at the same time is a way to transcend instinct. When action becomes ritual, the brain stops negotiating. There is no longer, "Should I do it today?" only, "It's time." At this level, you no longer waste energy deciding. All energy flows directly into doing. Jung described this state like that of a meditator. They don't sit because they have to sit, but because not sitting would mean not being themselves. That's when action becomes reflex, no longer forced by will, but moved by a retrained instinct. In Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire from Olympus and gave it to mankind. That fire symbolizes conscious will, the power to command instinct. But he was chained to a rock, his liver eaten daily by an eagle, and it grew back every night. That wasn't punishment. It was a symbol of discipline. Every day, the old self is devoured so that the new self may be born. When you train, you carry Prometheus within, enduring pain to keep the fire of will alive. The body follows cycles, hormones, internal clocks, but the will does not. Jung called this the suprabiological ritual, teaching your body a new rhythm. At first, it resists. By the 10th day, it prepares before you call. One morning you wake before the alarm, not from discipline, but because the body has submitted to the will. At this level, discipline is no longer a fight, it is harmony. The body becomes an instrument, and the soul, the musician. Jung once said, "The spirit is the life of the body seen from within, and the body is the outward manifestation of the life of the spirit." When the soul is strong, the body becomes a servant, not a cage. And that is the level of discipline that terrifies others most, when biology no longer has the power to stop the soul from fulfilling its calling. You no longer ask, "Should I do it?" because you already are the one who does. Choose one small act, meditation, writing, exercise, and turn it into ritual. Do it long enough, and the body will stop resisting and start following. That's when will rises above flesh, and the soul becomes the silent commander. Number 4. The sacred monotony, when boredom becomes the gateway to freedom. When your body has been trained to obey the soul, When action is no longer effort but natural rhythm, you enter the most uncomfortable yet sacred stage of discipline: monotony. Modern people despise repetition. We're addicted to novelty, new feelings, new information, new pleasures. But Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. When you start feeling bored, it's not a sign you're on the wrong path. It's the moment your mind is being forced to face itself. At the point where everything feels dull, the ego begins to dissolve, and the depth of the soul begins to open. Jung believed that most people live on the surface waves of consciousness, mistaking novelty for growth. But change is not always evolution. Many people change jobs, habits, and goals just to escape boredom, when in truth, they're running from themselves. When you constantly need something new, you're saying, I've never gone deep enough to find meaning in what I already have. Repetition, sustained long enough, erodes the ego. At first you exercise, meditate, or journal, you feel noble, virtuous. But after a few weeks, the feeling fades. Things become normal, even dull. No more inspiration, no more reward, only endless repetition. And that's when most people quit, thinking, I must be doing something wrong. But this is the true threshold. When action no longer brings pleasure, it begins to reach a deeper layer, where you act not to be praised, not to improve, not to feel good, but simply because it is right. That's the death of the performer within you. You no longer feel special, no longer see progress, but in that stillness, Jung said, you begin to meet your soul. Picture a man rowing a boat. When he first learns, he struggles to balance, fears hitting rocks, fears being swept away. But after enough time, his hands become part of the oar. He no longer controls the river, he flows with it. That is form becomes freedom, as Zen Master Dogen said. Discipline, when it reaches absolute monotony, ceases to be bondage. It becomes a doorway to freedom. In a Jungian therapy session, I once heard the story of a professional ballet dancer in Berlin. For 15 years, she practiced the same sequence of movements every morning. Small, repetitive, almost boring motions. Some days she hated the mirror, the music, everything. But she never stopped. One day, while spinning, she felt time freeze. No music, no self, only pure movement. She said she no longer felt she was turning, but being turned by something greater. After that, she never saw discipline as torture again. She realized that within endless repetition lies a sacred kind of freedom. Freedom from ego, comparison, and the hunger for results. The fear of boredom is the ego's strongest defense. When you feel bored, it means the ego is no longer being fed by progress or specialness. It will whisper, change direction, find something new. But if you can stay within the repetition, you'll discover something miraculous. Monotony becomes sacred, because when the mind has nothing left to resist, it dissolves. When the will stops chasing outcomes, it merges with the process. And there, true freedom appears. Not freedom to do anything, but freedom from the compulsion to always do something. Jung once said, in each of us there is another whom we do not know. Monotony is the road to meet that other, the deepest, quietest part of you. And if you can keep practicing even when there's no thrill, no reward, no recognition, it means you've crossed the line of the ordinary. So, if you ever feel bored on your path of discipline, remember, boredom is not a sign of misdirection, but the final test before freedom. And that is the level Jung called the most frightening, when you no longer need motivation to continue because you have merged with the act itself. At this stage, discipline is no longer a choice. It is the nature of the living soul. If you've ever reached that moment, when you no longer force yourself, no longer seek reward, but simply act because it's who you are, comment the word freedom below. Perhaps that single word is the signal to the universe that you're ready to enter the deeper level of discipline, where action and soul become one. Number 5. The unbroken flow. When you learn to flow, not just do. If repetition is the gateway to freedom, then maintaining the flow is how you protect that freedom. Jung once wrote, "Archetypes resemble the beds of rivers, dried up because the water has deserted them, though it may return at any time." He used this image to describe the human soul like a river, sometimes narrowing, sometimes drying. But what matters is that it never stops flowing. Because when you stop, even for a day, you're not merely resting. You're allowing the old self to seep back in, dragging you toward the rhythm you once struggled to escape. True discipline is not about strength. It's about continuity. Modern people confuse rest with disconnection. Rest is natural. It restores energy while the inner flow continues. Disconnection is when you step out of that state of being and fall back into old patterns. A lazy day may seem harmless, but if it seeps into your flow, it clouds the whole river. Discipline at this level is no longer about repetition. It's about movement, even when conditions change. You can be busy, tired, in pain, uninspired, but you keep your energy unbroken. That's the difference between someone who practices and someone who lives in practice. The first acts when conditions allow. The second acts regardless of conditions, because it's their nature. I once heard of an artist in Florence who, for 20 years, went to the banks of the Arno River every morning to sketch the sky. Not to sell, not to post, but because it was how she met herself. On rainy days, she was soaked. On sunny days, tourists stopped to admire. But rain or shine, she went. When asked why she never skipped, she said, "If I skip one day, the painting inside me stops too." That sentence carries Jung's spirit. True discipline is not perfection, it is non-interruption. Every time you continue, even under the worst conditions, you're sending a signal to your unconscious. I am the one who doesn't stop. Once the unconscious believes that, your energy begins to sustain itself. Remember, 1 minute of practice is better than a day of regret. 1 paragraph is stronger than a blank page. 1 mindful breath is deeper than an hour of avoidance. As long as you keep moving, even slightly, you're still winning. When you see no results, when life seems stagnant, the answer is not change the plan, it's keep the flow. Sometimes the soul only wants you to stay long enough to witness the transformation happening beneath the surface. A modern example is Serena Williams, an icon of relentless discipline. Over 2 decades of competition, she became known not just for talent, but for her ability to return after every fall. Injured, pregnant, doubted, she still trained, even if only 15 minutes a day. When asked why, Serena said, "If I stop for one day, I have to start again like everyone else. I'm not afraid to lose. I'm afraid to stop." That is the level of discipline Jung called terrifying, not because it's harsh, but because it's unbreakable. Our problem is we act only when we feel ready. But discipline at this stage teaches a deeper truth. Movement creates readiness, not the other way around. There is no perfect morning, No ideal mood, only small actions sustained long enough to become a natural flow. One day you'll realize, what sets you apart isn't bursts of power, but the absence of interruption. People fear consistency, fear repetition. But within it, the soul learns what the modern world has forgotten. Real power lies not in speed, but in the endurance of flow. Jung once said, "Nothing prevents the soul from becoming what it is, except itself." When you refuse to stop, you're teaching your soul that nothing, not fatigue, not doubt, can block its current. And one day you'll understand. True discipline is not about controlling yourself, but trusting the current within. And when you can keep that current unbroken, you've reached the level that makes the world bow. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady as a river flowing through all seasons. Number 6. Preparing before the battles. When consciousness trains the unconscious to react. There is a level of discipline that Jung called active imagination, the place where consciousness not only governs, but begins to train the unconscious. At this level, you no longer wait for yourself to feel inspired before acting. You teach your mind how to respond before circumstances arise. This is no longer will-based discipline, but the strategy of preparation. Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." That saying does not apply only to encounters between people, but also to the meeting between your own consciousness and unconscious. Two forces constantly colliding, wrestling, and shaping the way you react to every battle of life. When these two begin to meet, through preparation, through your deliberate training of the mind to respond before the challenge appears, a deep transformation begins. Every time you write down situations that might make you give up, you are training the hidden soldiers of your inner army, so when the enemy, procrastination, fear, fatigue, strikes, they already know what to do. If you don't prepare, the unconscious will act from old programming, choosing comfort over challenge, rest over progress. You will mistake that for your personality, when in truth, it is only an outdated strategy. But when you consciously create a new response, if I'm tired, I will breathe. If I'm afraid, I will take one smallest action. You're teaching the unconscious to fight under new orders from the soul. And in that moment, you no longer have to win against yourself. You have become the commander, where consciousness gives orders and the unconscious obeys. That is the art of preparation before battle, not waiting for the enemy to appear before drawing your sword, but keeping it sharp, steady, and luminous even in the dark. Imagine a woman in the middle of crisis, work piling up, a sick child, her health declining. Each morning, she writes down every reason that once made her quit: tired, busy, bored, uninspired. Then she adds a line for each. If I'm tired, I will meditate for 1 minute. If I'm busy, I will take 3 deep breaths. If I'm overwhelmed, I will pause for 10 seconds to observe my mind. Not to force herself, but to pre-program her reactions. And strangely, a few weeks later, when a truly difficult morning comes, the child cries, deadlines loom, her head throbs. She doesn't panic. Her hand instinctively rises to her chest. She inhales deeply and sits for 1 minute. No thought intervenes. She isn't trying to be disciplined. She simply operates from a reflex already installed. Neuroscientists call this implementation intention, a pre-coded plan of action. Research at Gollwitzer University found that when people predetermine their response to specific triggers, for example, if it rains, I'll train indoors, their success rate in maintaining habits increases by up to 91%. Why? Because the brain no longer wastes energy making decisions in moments of crisis. The decision has already been packaged inside the unconscious, ready to activate like a program. That's when consciousness becomes the commander, not through power, but through strategy. Jung saw this as an active dialogue between the two layers of the psyche, a conversation where consciousness trains the unconscious like a master training a student, repeating the same movement until the body reacts without thought. True discipline doesn't come from pressure, but from teaching the right reflex before the battle begins. Write down every reason you've ever used to give up, and attach a replacement response to each. If I'm exhausted, I'll just breathe. If I lose motivation, I'll reread a Jung quote. If I fail, I'll return tomorrow. As you repeat this, you're not merely planning, you're reprogramming your nervous system, turning every small action into a message to the depths of your soul. Jung called this psychological alchemy, the transmutation of psyche into new energy. Every time you choose to react differently, you reshape the neural pathways of the unconscious, reigniting what he called the inner fire, the living flame that had slept within old habits. This fire is not motivation, it is the primal vitality awakened when consciousness and the unconscious move as one. When you prepare deeply enough, you no longer fear crises, because the fire already burns within, silent, steady, and bright. You do not win through strength, but through preparation. For when the world begins to test you, what keeps you standing is not willpower, it is the reflex of a soul trained in silence. If these words reach you, as a whisper that true power is not born in the moment of action, but forged quietly in unseen mornings, leave a like on this video. Not to support me, but to send a signal to the universe that you are ready to enter the level where you no longer wait for inspiration to act, because you have become the commander of your own mind. Number 7. The death and rebirth of the disciplined soul. When the journey completes, a part of you has died. The weak one, the negotiator, the excuse maker. And a new part is born, unbroken, unwavering. Jung called this the death and rebirth of the self. This level of discipline frightens others, not because you are harsh, but because you are untouchable. You no longer act from motivation, you act because your soul has chosen the path. Carl Jung once said, "Only that which is truly oneself has the power to heal. Only what is authentically yours can heal you." And discipline, at its deepest level, is the return to that authenticity, no longer forced behavior, but absolute loyalty to your soul. It is the death of the old self, the one that always needed inspiration, reasons, and witnesses, giving way to a quiet, steadfast being. When discipline becomes soul, you no longer have to command yourself. You live by a rhythm etched into your blood, your habits, your instincts. I remember a story of a woman named Elias, a 42-year-old mountaineer from Switzerland. She once fell nearly 20 meters down a cliff and was told she would never climb again. But Elias refused to accept it. Every day, even with crutches, she went to the nearby hill just to watch others climb. A year later, she began training again, not to prove anything, but because she knew that if she didn't live that way, she would no longer be herself. She said, "I don't train to climb mountains. I train because my soul only lives when it climbs." 2 years later, Elias returned to the same cliff. She climbed slowly, no cameras, no audience. At the summit, she stood silently beneath the sky. Later she wrote, "I no longer need to win. I just need to return to my own flow." At that level, discipline is no longer effort. It is a state of being, where you are no longer separate from the act, but identical with it. In the early stages, you practice discipline to change yourself. In the final stage, you practice to sustain your soul, like the flame in ancient Greek temples, not roaring, yet never extinguished. The guardian of that flame isn't the strongest person, but the one who never abandons their post. Every day, they perform one simple task, adding oil to the lamp. A small act, yet that smallness keeps the light alive for thousands of years. That is the most beautiful metaphor for discipline, not climbing the highest peak, but keeping the flame burning through the longest night. Others may see repetition and think you are dull, but only you know each repetition renews your soul. True discipline is not about resisting fatigue, it's about letting fatigue pass without interrupting your action. At this level, you no longer live on motivation. Motivation is the wind, discipline is the root. Those who live by the wind must keep searching for it. Those who live by the root can stay still and still grow. Once your soul has chosen a path, you need no reason to continue. Every step, every action becomes a silent prayer to the sacred within you. Look back on the journey. You've gone from facing the shadow to turning behavior into identity, to transcending the body, to passing through monotony, to maintaining flow, to preparing before battles, and now to rebirth. Every part of you that once feared, resisted, or fled is now quiet. Not because it disappeared, but because it has been integrated into a new order, where every conflict becomes energy for stability. Jung called this individuation the journey of becoming yourself. But in the context of discipline, it is also integration, the unification of every part within. Here, will is no longer something you use against instinct, but the current flowing through instinct. Discipline is no longer a choice, it is how your soul breathes. Jung once said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. One who hasn't gone through his own inferno can never rise above it. And the one who hasn't died in the journey of discipline can never be reborn as a free soul." So the final question is not, are you disciplined, but are you ready to let the old self die? Discipline, at its deepest, is not a chain that binds man, but the art of leading the soul back to its true orbit. Those who reach this state no longer need to talk about goals or effort, they simply act, and their stillness makes the world pause to watch. They don't race anyone, for they have already conquered themselves. They don't need admiration, for their greatest reward is the serenity of living in alignment with the soul's chosen path. Such a person does not need motivation to rise each morning. They are awakened by an inner calling. They don't need reminders to strive, because maintaining discipline is no longer an action, but a breath. And that breath, steady, quiet, enduring, becomes the silent music that plays amid a chaotic world. If you feel this truth, if something within you whispers that perhaps it is time to return, to rebuild your essence, to teach the unconscious to stand with the soul, then the journey has already begun. Share this message with someone searching for their strength, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next lessons from Carl Jung. Because true discipline doesn't just change habits, it awakens the soul. And when that happens, nothing in this world can break you again.